Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Ronnie Pontiac, and Ronnie was an assistant researcher with Manly P. Hall for many years, and he's the co-author with Tamra Lucid in The Magic of the Orphic Mysteries. So welcome, Ronnie.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
I was probably introduced to Orphism through James Hillman and Thomas More, who introduced me to Ficino. But I've noticed in the Jungian world that people have written books about all kinds of mythic figures, you know, Hermes and Apollo and Dionysus, but not a lot's, you know, Orpheus is kind of a little bit under the radar as a figure. So I was hoping that we could maybe talk a little bit about, to start, a little bit about Ficino, the influence of the Orphic Mysteries on Ficino, and maybe take it from there.
Sure. One of my favorite subjects. Ficino, I think part of the reason that he isn't that well known is because the work that he did was so technical and scholarly. And I think also that he sits in this moment where there's so much amazing talent that's happening. Botticelli and Leonardo and Michelangelo and the Medicis are in full power. And so there's so much to write about and to look at that Ficino, I think, was taken as maybe Cosimo de' Medici's pet scholar. But if you begin to dig into the history and into what Ficino's influence was, you discover that he was actually the father of the Renaissance in some ways. So here we have the story of somebody who, at the age of 10, is recognized by Cosimo de' Medici as being a brilliant child. His father is Cosimo's doctor. Cosimo brings him into his own household so he can have all the advantages of education. And he learns so rapidly that still at a very young age, he becomes Lorenzo de' Medici's tutor. And as he develops into a man, he's a priest at one point, he studies medicine at another point. But what he's really loving is translating the few fragments of Plato that still exist in Europe, which wasn't much, and trying to extrapolate from that what Plato's doctrine was. But his father and the church don't want him to do this. Plato is kind of looked at as something that's a little too pagan, a little too occult. They want him if he's going.
Aristotle was kind of the
That's who they
man
want him to
for
study.
the church.
Aristotle and then Lucretius, all of Aristotle's
Mm,
followers, in a sense. That's who he should be
mm,
devoting his talents to if he wants to do this.
yeah.
But he's not too thrilled about Aristotle. When
Mm,
he's studying medicine, one gets the feeling that it's really his dad saying, "Look, man, you need a job."
mm,
And what are you going to do? I'm a doctor. I can help you out. Let's do this. But he gets very depressed. He's always prone to melancholy. He writes
mm,
about that and studies it. And so he reaches a point in life where he's at his first Saturn return. And he's
mm.
aware of that, being somebody who's very interested in astrology. And
That's
he's
about
having
28, isn't it, or
right
something
in
like that?
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's having his Saturn return moment. So he
Mm,
feels that he's a failure. He's getting old. He's waited too long. What's he going to do with his life?
mm,
It's all bad. And the one thing that he longs to do to
mm,
get at these ancient texts, he doesn't have the money. He does.
mm,
How's he going to feed himself? How's he going to have a roof over his head if he sits around translating Plato all day?
mm,
At the same time, Cosimo de' Medici lucks into getting this amazing amount of lost knowledge that was preserved in what they then called Arabia.
mm,
And this was Plato and the Neoplatonists and the Orphic hymns and the Hermetica. I mean, the
mm,
foundation of the ancient sources of Western esotericism were all rediscovered at this point because someone who was searching for old manuscripts found them in Arabia and brought them back to Cosimo, who purchased them. But Ficino doesn't know this. So he's in his father's house and he's very upset, and he decides to perform one of the hymns of Orpheus, the hymn to the cosmos. And this is just not really a magical act so much as it's an expression of like a prayer of just desperation and trying to address the world and ask for this that he doesn't think he can have. And right as he's performing this hymn,
Just to say, sorry, just to cut in
sure,
there for 1 second, right? He wants to lead the contemplative life too, doesn't he? I mean, that was the thing. That's
mhm.
his decision, really. So,
Yes, he was
from
certainly
what you were
not.
saying before, the
Yeah, he
doctor
wasn't too
thing is
what not
gone.
motivated to be a politician or a creative artist, in theatrical worlds, and
Mm,
he really was this contemplative, saturnine kind of person.
mm,
And even when he became this huge influence, it all happened in the house he was living in. Everybody came to him, more or less.
mm.
And so there he is doing this hymn, and he's
Mm.
addressing the cosmos, and he's singing and performing on the Lyra da Braccia, and he's not saying, please give me this opportunity to do this, but he's feeling it while he's singing these ancient words. And then at that moment, a messenger comes to the door. His father interrupts him. There's a letter from Cosimo de' Medici. The letter says, I am in Correggi. I am waiting for you. I have all the manuscripts of Plato and all these other things, and I've got the Hermetica, and I want you to translate all of this. And I'm going to give you the house that I'm in right now to live in for the rest of your life to do this work. And the village nearby will support you. And please come and bring your lyre and teach us what it means to live a good life.
One of the
And
great
so,
synchronistic moments in history, although there have been many.
certainly, yes,
But
there have.
this is one of the great ones.
It's a wonderful one. So he goes, and he is what he finds is that Cosimo is beginning to die, and that's part of the reason that he's so drawn to this, because he doesn't feel that he is satisfied an understanding of the soul and the meaning of life from the church. And so he has heard all this about Plato, and he wants to know, what is the ancient wisdom. So while he's doing these translations, often he's reading them to the bedridden Cosimo. So he's reading the Hermetica as he translates it. He's reading a Platonic dialogue to Cosimo, who's in bed and listening to this. And it's giving great joy to Cosimo. So what happens is, not only does he do these translations, and at first are circulating in manuscript, and they're hugely influential because people and Plato is a very different thing than Aristotle, and it has this metaphysical side to it with reincarnation and Atlantis and all these concepts that become woven throughout the history of Western esotericism. And so he has these kind of gatherings of his friends where he will play and sing the hymns for fun sometimes, sometimes for healing a sick friend, sometimes just, to lift everybody's spirits, to get inspiration for their own individual creative projects. And we have this wonderful record from Poliziano, one of his friends, who talks about, oh my God, we were all there, and he was singing these incredible hymns and the beautiful music and the beautiful words, and then what he had to say about it. And we were there like late into the night, and I was so inspired that I went home and I worked all night into the next day on my work. And so he created actually what was sort of an early opera. I mean, it was a written statement that would be said by an actor with musical accompaniment and sets by, I think it was Leonardo da Vinci, and it was called Orpheus. And it was, even more importantly, it was written in the common language. It was not written in Latin. And this was a
mm,
scandal at the time that
mm.
somebody would use this vulgar language of the peoples because that meant that the people would get it and that they weren't supposed to. Only the elite who could speak Latin were supposed to get it. So this was a revolutionary moment.
The
And
vernacular. They started to
yes,
use the vernacular. Yeah.
exactly. And so Botticelli is there, and there's no doubt that his incredible portrait of the birth of Venus was partly inspired by these hymns and by hearing Aphrodite addressed. And then there's Pico della Mirandola, who shows up actually for Ficino's second Saturn return and becomes this very close friend of his and who delineates these ideas even further to such a degree that he gets in trouble with the church because he's saying that what the church needs is Plato and the Neoplatonists and Orpheus in order to fully understand the meanings of these inner doctrines and to be fully Christed. And the church is, furious. They censored him. And actually, the tragedy of that was that when that happened, Pico felt very, very vulnerable. Many historians believe that he was gay. He might have been Poliziano's lover, and that wasn't entirely okay. And so he was in a dangerous predicament. And when the church is now looking at him like that, they notice this about him, he's even more trouble. And he came up with a brilliant idea of pressing this preacher that he heard talking about the Neoplatonists into being his and Leonardo de Medici's personal priests. This guy was in really good with the Vatican, and yet he was brilliant at Neoplatonism. And he was also kind of a prophet who had visions, a very passionate sermonizer, and very known for his vow of poverty. Well, his name was Savonarola.
Mm,
So the man who tried to kill the Renaissance was
mm,
invited into this circle because he was learned in Neoplatonism and many of these subjects, but he was learned in it in order to tear them down. And he considered Ficino a pagan. So Pico brings him into that world, and almost immediately he starts attacking Lorenzo, right? He starts saying, look at this rich tyrant who's, living on the blood of the poor. And well, that's, Lorenzo's not too happy about that. However, Savonarola becomes so powerful and he kind of makes a deal with the Pope and with foreign kings, and he takes over Florence and he kicks out the de Medicis, who are now considered these decadent rich tyrants, and he initiates the bonfire of the vanities, which was when it was like a hysteria that spread through Florence. All of a sudden, all these people who'd been famous for very worldly lives, famous
mm,
for all the affairs that they would have and their romances, and famous
mm,
for their indiscretions and their drinking and their art and their paganism and all the amazing, brilliant artists, because really the Renaissance begins in Florence.
mm,
And all of a sudden, all of those beautiful things are thrown aside in the twinkling of an eye, and they're all very Christian all of a sudden. They've decided that they've been wrong, and now Savonarola is right, and they're going to be good Christians and are going to burn books
mm,
and paintings and furniture. I mean, who knows what masterpieces were lost in this hysteria? I hate to call it hysteria because of the origin of that word,
mm,
but it's something like that. And he didn't last long. He wound up being burned in the middle of the plaza of Florence, and the de Medicis were invited back because when Savonarola pushed too far, even the Pope, and one of the problems was that this was probably the most corrupt Pope. It was a Borgia Pope,
mm,
and he went after that Pope and said
mm,
he's corrupt. And well, of
mm,
course, the Pope wasn't going to tolerate that, and he excommunicated him. And
mm.
when he was excommunicated, all of a sudden, the citizens of Florence thought, whoa, 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 this priest that we changed our lives for, and I mean, he's not even a priest anymore. So we better
And that
clean up.
maybe they were getting a bit sick of the cancel culture as well.
Oh,
You
very
know,
much.
it's amazing how there's these swings between the opening and the blossoming and
Isn't it?
the
It's so
repression
interesting.
and the,
Yeah.
you know.
And Florence didn't, I mean, it remained, of course, a cultural center, but it never reached the full flowering again. Ficino only lived a year or two after this. His books were
Mm,
burned as well. Probably the only reason that he escaped some kind of punishment was because by then he was a very favored and protected son of Florence. And the
mm,
Bishop of Florence had already saved his ass a while back when
mm,
he suddenly somebody noticed that he was writing all this pagan stuff and they went
mm,
after him from the Vatican. And somebody
mm,
said, "No, this is a treasure of Florence. He's a brilliant scholar. We love him. Don't leave him alone." And they did.
mm,
So that's Ficino's story in a nutshell. He devoted his life to these translations and to singing these hymns and to inspiring his friends and to understanding the universe and how to be a servant of God and of divine love. And the secret that he taught was that, as he put it, that there is no more powerful magic than love. And he also said that the Orphic hymns taught him about love. So
mm,
his definition of love, the way I take it, is love is how the divine shows mercy to us by showing us ways to tune ourselves like instruments so that we resonate with the divine, so we can recover our own divine natures and then be true servants of the highest. And that was what his goal was. He was hugely influential because not only were all these people that we think of in that early first phase of the Renaissance buzzing around his circle, but then we see the influence continuing. So Agrippa, who becomes the most plagiarized occult author in history, and whose books, even though they are so difficult, because his most famous book about the occult, he's saying in the book, I wish I hadn't wasted 20 years of my life on this stuff, and it's terrible, it's wrong, I shouldn't have done it. And then he tells you every single little thing about the occult like he's teaching it to you. And so scholars argue, did he do that because he was trying to protect himself? Probably not, because he's in that book and in other books, he just reads the riot act about priests. So he obviously wasn't trying to seem like he wasn't doing that. So we're not really sure what was happening there. But
mm.
but he is the author on the occult. And then even the dark side, the left-hand path of occult in the West is given to him because the fourth book of Agrippa, which was one of the most influential in the development of that area of pursuit of metaphysics, that was a probably not him at all. It was something that was signed as him, but his own students said, no, 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 he never wrote that, and he never would have because he didn't believe in that kind of magic. And if you
Mm,
do read between the lines of his books that we know are his books, what makes it very unlikely that he's doing this kind of, you know, borderline black magic is that his secret to what gives the magician power, his secret to what protects the magician from demons is Christ. So to him, the center of magic was Jesus, and you had to have faith in
mm.
Jesus Christ in order to be a good magician. So
And
that's
with
not the kind of,
Ficino, the Orphic hymn was, love was the secret of magic. So it's a very important point to make
Mhm.
about that, because there's still a lot of people, when they hear the word occult or magic, they immediately kind of tend towards that dark side of it, don't they?
Definitely. And of course, it's gotten so much publicity, the light
Mm,
side of it, the theurgy and all of that, which is theurgy is the God making, which is how do we again tune ourselves to the divine to bring out the divine in ourselves.
yeah.
Those pursuits are not nearly as well known.
Mm,
But let's continue with Ficino's influence because it's amazing. So from
yeah.
there, he you have Paracelsus as the next big figure. It's 100 years. I mean, these three lives, Ficino, Agrippa, and Paracelsus cover 100 years. And yet they are, I would argue, the most important time for the establishment of Western esotericism because of those three people. And there's others, of course, Giordano Bruno and John Dee and many others. But um, he's a direct influence on Paracelsus as well. And Paracelsus revolutionizes medicine. He's really the father of pharmaceutical medicine. He's the first guy to start using substances and chemicals and metals and such in a way that is similar to what we now do in making medicines. He named zinc, for example, and many other, excuse me, scientific names in that area are things that he coined. Um, but some of his stuff is wild, like crazy, witchcrafty kind of recipes. But when he was in Italy, he found the works of Ficino on medicine. And he did say that of all the Italian doctors, Ficino was the greatest, and he learned the most from his work. So here we have again Ficino's influence, and and this will continue. But yet the interesting thing is that he sort of fades. Ficino himself isn't mentioned that often. Like as Western esotericism takes off, everybody talks about Agrippa, everybody talks about Paracelsus, but so much of what's in Agrippa is Ficino.
Right.
And Ficino gets left behind perhaps because he was so, into the Greek stuff. So he was like Thomas Taylor in England hundreds of years later, who is immersed in all these rare writings and brings them into English translations for the first time, and is also immersed in Ficino, and yet is laughed at by the Englishmen of his time as being a pagan. And so that makes people think he's into witchcraft, and he's running around at night, with a broom, and he's actually this scholar who's spending all
He's
his time.
perhaps a classicist.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And also just the sort of I mean, there's certainly a Christian um, hostility to differing opinions, different sources of wisdom from the past that is different from the respect that you find for those things in parts of Islam. And that's why we have so much more of this stuff preserved through Islam than we did in Europe, even though there were European monks who were also copying some of this stuff and who made it possible for us to have it. But there is this judgmental quality that there's only one thing that's right. It's our interpretation of the Bible, and everything else is satanic. That's
Yeah.
it's a rough way to go through life, but it's also when it's a dominant society, it's going to write people and events and books out of history. At a time, owning a book by Agrippa or being a bookseller who got a copy of an Agrippa book for a client in another country was a death sentence in Europe. And people died because of an Agrippa book. It's amazing. So Ficino sets in motion these currents. So Paracelsus is a huge influence on the Rosicrucians. Agrippa is a huge influence on the Golden Dawn and on Eliphas Levi, and so through them, his ideas, which are not strictly Platonic. I mean, he is mixing other things in there. There are magical qualities in his work, and his astrology interest, for example, is not going to be in Plato. And so that turns into a way that the Orphic mythology and philosophy returns to Europe. And that in itself becomes an incredible river of influence. There's no subject that was covered more often in opera than Orpheus, for example.
I think you said somewhere that, the Orphic culture, the Orphic mysteries, it's like the first counterculture. And it's kind of always had this like, for example, with Thomas Taylor, you were saying, well, with Ficino, maybe, how he was perhaps not as well known later on, but they were the seminal people that influenced many people. And it was similar with Thomas Taylor too, wasn't it? I mean, it's that
Yes.
he
Well,
might have
Tom, the
had his
funny thing is,
critics, but he was influencing many people.
there's a famous story about how Emerson, who was a big fan of Thomas Taylor, and
Mm,
because it was through Taylor that he was able to encounter some of his favorite authors like Proclus
mm,
and Plato, of course, and Plotinus. And so he goes to England, and Emerson is he thinks that the English are going to hold up Taylor as this phenomenal genius. And he starts asking his friends, so Thomas Taylor, and the ones who know of him think he's an idiot.
mm,
And many of people have no idea who he is. And Emerson actually is kind of stunned that somebody who's so brilliant and who helped him so much is being treated that way. And it's also an interesting note, by the way, about him is that Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the first feminist book, really, when
mm,
she was a young woman, or really a child, she was um, living under the roof of Thomas Taylor. He was her landlord. Her mother was staying there, and she said once that the only place she ever felt safe in the whole world was napping in Thomas Taylor's study while he was working on his Neoplatonist books.
and when you were talking, it reminded me a little bit of the alchemists that labored away in obscurity
Mhm.
sometimes. It seems like, but the misconception of alchemy, the lack of understanding where someone could have that uh, deep soul work in my language going on.
Yeah. And I'd like to come back to what you said about counterculture.
Mm,
Um, that Orpheus book is actually the second in a series of three that I've written. The first one's about American metaphysical religion. The second one is co-authored with my wife, and it's about Orphism. And then the
mm,
third one is the Rosicrucian book that'll be coming out around Christmas. And
mm,
this is a counterculture trilogy. I
mm,
wanted to show how American metaphysical religion has always been here from the very earliest days of the colonization, and how it's always been an influence, and how
mm,
America was never as Christian as we've been taught it was, and that
mm,
it had less interest in Christianity than advertised, and more interest in this other stuff than anyone ever imagined, and how many important people were influenced by it. And then the Orphic one is like stepping back and saying, look at look at the stream through history of this counterculture, which starts out as, I think, a Pythagorean effort to reform Dionysian religion and make it a civic religion, and to change this culture which is rural originally and which is sacrificing animals. And we should remember that animal sacrifice in those days was like a barbecue. I mean, you made a ceremony out of sacrificing the animal to the gods, but everybody ate. And so it really was like a banquet almost. Yet you were still killing animals for the gods, and warriors were held up as the highest, thing in society. I mean, that's everybody. Any man wanted to die as a famous warrior. That was the
mm,
highest achievement of the Olympian Greeks. And women had a very low stature. Even in Athens, which was a democracy, women who were raped, if they were married, they had to be divorced, and they always bore the blame for being raped. So it wasn't very democratic for the ladies. And you had this, it was a civic culture built around service in the army to protect the polis, to protect the city.
mm,
And along comes this new religion.
mm,
Around 1200 BC, we're seeing the religion of Dionysius coming in. And this does seem to be a foreign intrusion, very likely from India, but from somewhere. Joseph Campbell's opinion was that it really wasn't from one place so much as a bunch of these kind of religions happened during a time when the weather shifted, people were starving, there was disease, and so the whole tone turned into a great lamentation in a way. And it
mm,
changed from this bold sort of, the gods are right and we're strong and we have an army, into the world as a veil of suffering, and we have to pray to God, please gods, grace us with mercy. And so I try to tell people about this, that as the Orphic influence occurs, the Dionysian religion is bloody. I mean, people would even cover themselves in blood. People would stand under the bull while it was being killed to be covered in its blood. And women had power in that religion, the Maenads. And as was captured by Euripides in his tragedy, the Bacchae, you see this old school Olympian king, Pentheus, who's a man's
mm.
man, and then he's wondering why the women of his kingdom are all running up into the mountains and acting crazy. And he doesn't
Mm,
like it. It's loss of control and it's disturbing the city.
mm,
And he hears that Dionysius is wandering around, or somebody claiming to be. And this Dionysius shows up. And Euripides never makes clear if this is really Dionysius or a priest of Dionysius who's representing the god. And you never really can be sure. And when he sees this effeminate man surrounded by drunken people and women who are half naked and everyone's laughing, it's just the opposite of what he
mm.
wants in his kingdom.
Was a
And
little
he's
lowbrow for Pentheus, and
as
but
exactly.
in Jung language, it might be that the rational mind that doesn't, what is it, that represses some of the deeper human sentiment,
This is what I think
is maybe
Euripides
more likely to be attacked by the
I think Euripides really is showing us that if that the attempt to be entirely rational and to
mm,
eliminate the irrational is
yeah,
dangerous.
yeah,
And so eventually what happens is, of course, Pentheus has Dionysius put into a jail cell, and Dionysius warns him, the god's not going to like this.
mm,
There's an earthquake, the jail is knocked down, the chains
mm,
fall right off of Dionysius, and he just strolls out.
mm,
Pentheus sees this and he's taken into a mania. He doesn't
mm,
understand what's happening in
mm,
front of him, and he's
yeah,
furious.
mm,
And Dionysius diffuses this by saying, "Well, you're just curious about what the women are doing, right?" And Pentheus, "Yes, yes, that's how this all started." "Well, there's a way you can find out." "How?" "Well, I could dress you up as a woman and you could go there and pretend, and then you could see for yourself." "Do you think it would work?" "Of course." So Dionysius gets him women's clothes, and here this manly man who was so rational is suddenly dressing up, and there's a touch of comedy because he's concerned about how he looks.
mm.
And when he goes there,
He gets torn
Dionysius,
apart.
well, Dionysius betrays him. Yeah, he basically says, "Ladies, there's a man here dressed as a woman." And they're in their frenzy of their worship and their separation. They're so furious at this insult to the god and to them that his own mother rips his head off.
And
I mean,
for
just in,
for
in
the
rage.
benefit of kind of Jungian listeners, it's kind of, what I get from that is
Hmm.
when Jung talks about wholeness being an understanding of the light and dark, you know,
Yeah,
um, that repression doesn't really work, and there's a certain kind of
right.
elitism, which is you know, the Dionysian was kind of democratic in those times, but the and I think what Jung says is that often with a neurosis that if people kind of repress the weird, or they don't accept that the other side or whatever,
Hmm.
that the neurosis actually comes up and grabs them from behind, which is a little bit like the
Yeah,
maenads grabbing him from behind and
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what he
tearing
was
him up.
saying. And he even tells us, Euripides, that this is the danger when you're dealing with the gods. You
Mm,
must respect the gods, and the gods aren't rational necessarily.
mm,
So now that religion, which is disruptive and bloody and
mm,
still sacrificing animals, I think in the hands of the Pythagoreans, it becomes something different. And this is the Orphic religion now. And I like to explain to people what the difference would be.
mm,
So if you're just, let's say you're some regular guy, you're not a great warrior, just weren't born with that kind of a build. You're not that brilliant. You're just who you are. You've not been treated that well because the warriors, don't respect you,
mm.
and the sophists think you're stupid, and
Achilles might have sniggered at you somewhere down there.
right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you you're used to walking around kind of with your shoulders down, and just I'm just, I'm just trying to live my life here. You get initiated into the Orphic Mysteries, and what you're taught is, Achilles, when he was sniggering at you, he's an idiot because what's happened there is he's lost himself. The fact
Mm,
that he goes out there and he kills all the time and he thinks that makes
mm,
him good, that
mm,
just means he's going to be born over and over and over again until he
mm,
realizes how bad what he's doing really is.
mm,
Because, he might be killing someone who was his relative that he loved deeply in another life.
mm,
The gods don't want you to kill, not other people and not animals. The gods want you to worship them with good deeds. And if
mm.
you want to do a sacrifice, how about a little honey and milk in the morning or some flowers? And now,
I would also say, I think Orpheus is for the artists and the musos and he's the god of the artists and the musos as well, isn't he? Like
oh, I think
when you talk
certainly.
about counterculture, that's what comes to mind. And I
Yes.
think as a maybe we're jumping ahead a little here, but to me, as a style of masculinity, that the Orphic is very big contributing style. You know, it's through. I mean, in our time, through the '60s, or but forever, really.
It keeps reappearing.
Yeah.
For instance, the troubadours, a
Mm,
big love culture based on Sufi romance. And
mm,
this troubadour culture, which had a lot of esotericism, they constantly talked about Orpheus. They called him Sir Orfeo. He was a knight. But
mm,
of course, the backward glance, that Orpheus loses his wife on their wedding day, and he goes into Hades to try to bring her back with a song. And that's a troubadour, and then
mm,
especially because he fails to bring her back, just as the troubadours dedicate themselves to unattainable women.
mm,
So he's a shadow over the whole troubadour movement that really established the idea of romantic love in the West. So over and over again, we find this Orphic influence, and it's civilizing and definitely as an inspiration to art and
mm,
and to a refinement of masculinity.